The first light of dawn barely touched the Black Sea when the horizon erupted in fire. Smoke rolled in thick curtains over the shattered beaches, mingling with the salt spray and the metallic stench of blood. From the jungle ridge beyond the ground, shook under the iron crawl of Japanese Kaiha tanks, their engines growling like predators closing in on prey. American infantrymen huddled in cratered sand and broken coral-clutched rifles they already knew were useless against the armor bearing down on them. The nightmare had become familiar rounds, sparking harmlessly off steel men, screaming as machine guns stitched the earth, and officers shouting for artillery that never came in time. Among them was Sergeant David Kelso, his hands trembling as he slammed another clip into his M1 Garand. He had fought in Saipan and Peleliu, and each time he watched Sherman shells bounce off Japanese hulls, as if they were pebbles thrown against a fortress wall. Around him, soldiers whispered. What none dared to say aloud, there was no stopping the steel beasts. Survival felt like luck, not skill. And yet on this morning, something stirred behind the lines. A new silhouette rolled forward, low and angular, its barrel longer than any weapon the Americans had seen on these islands. Whispers spread through the foxholes the weapon no one had believed would ever reach them had arrived at last. The men on the beach could not yet know it, but the balance of fear was about to shift. For the first time in the Pacific, Japan's armor was not untouchable. The question was no longer if American soldiers could stand against the oncoming tide, but how soon the tide itself would turn. The roar of engines that morning on Okinawa was not unfamiliar. American soldiers had heard it before. On Saipan, on Tarawa, on Peleliu, the guttural growl of Japanese armor grinding over coral and ash, the sound that told them another nightmare was about to unfold. The silhouettes coming out of the jungle were always the same squat, menacing Chiha tanks painted in mottled camouflage, supported by infantry who seemed to spring from the very earth. Behind them, hidden in caves and pillboxes carved into the volcanic ridges, waited artillery pieces and machine guns that had survived endless bombardment. The Americans had learned that nothing ever truly died on these islands until it was burned or buried by hand. They had Sherman tanks and M3 Lees of their own hulking machines that looked imposing on the parade grounds back in the States. But here in the Pacific, they were little more than targets. Their 75mm guns, once thought to be the answer to any battlefield problem, slammed uselessly against the thick frontal plates of Japanese defenses. When a shell struck the glacis of a Shiha, it was like watching sparks fly from a blacksmith's hammer, noise, smoke, and nothing more. Crews inside those Shermans knew the futility. They saw it every time a Japanese tank rolled forward, took 3, 4, sometimes 5 hits, and kept moving until its own gun thundered and another American vehicle burst into flames. It was worse for the infantry. They carried rifles, BARs, and flamethrowers, but none of it mattered when steel monsters pushed through their lines. Men threw grenades, crawled up with satchel charges, or tried to climb onto moving tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies. Some succeeded, many did not. To be pinned beneath treads or caught in the blast of your own desperate charge was a death every man on those beaches feared but prepared for in silence. The Japanese did not fight conventionally. They did not break and run when the odds turned. They fought from tunnels and caves, disappearing into the earth only to emerge where least expected. And when the command came for a Banzai charge, every soldier in earshot felt the ground quake with the stampede. Thousands of voices screamed Tenohaika Banzai as bodies hurled forward with rifles, bayonets, and grenades clutched in hands. Against machine guns, against artillery, they charged anyway. American lines buckled under the weight of fanaticism, bullets mowing down waves only for more to come behind them. When the smoke cleared, the ground was littered with corpses, but so too were the American positions shredded by blades, grenades, and sheer human will. Sergeant Kelso had seen it on Peleliu. His platoon held a ridge for 6 hours while waves of Japanese infantry crashed against them, supported by tanks that shrugged off every shot. By the time reinforcements arrived, only 9 of his 30 men were still breathing, and 3 of those would never walk again. He carried the memory of their faces, men he had trained with, eaten with, laughed with, now reduced to silence under the tropical Sunday. That memory returned every time he heard the metallic clatter of tank tracks echoing through jungle paths. Shermans tried to fight back their engines, roaring their guns, hammering at enemy armor. But too often the shells bounced the tanks overheated, or Japanese soldiers swarmed them with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. American crews inside were roasted alive, screaming through steel as their machines burned. The smell of cooked flesh mixed with gasoline became a part of the air, something every soldier carried in his lungs long after the battle ended. The men on the ground whispered dark jokes to survive it. They called their Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter lights every time. They joked that their 75mm rounds were better suited for knocking down palm trees than stopping tanks, but humor did not erase the truth. They were fighting an enemy whose armor and defenses had grown beyond the reach of their weapons, and every engagement ended the same way, with more graves dug into the coral earth. Artillery only added to the misery. The Japanese had mastered concealment. A gun could fire from a cave, killing a tank or a dozen men, and then vanish as shutters slammed over the entrance. Counter-battery fire wasted shells against stone. Only direct assaults could silence them, and that meant men crawling into darkness with flamethrowers and grenades, praying not to be cut down before they reached the opening. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood. The command reports grew desperate. Units wrote of ammunition wasted on armor that refused to die, of infantry decimated by tanks they could not stop, of morale buckling under the weight of constant futility. Officers tried to inspire courage, but men knew the truth. They were being sent against an enemy they could not kill fast enough, and every day meant more names written on casualty lists shipped back across the Pacific. By late 1944, the balance of fear was unmistakable. Japanese tanks may not have matched the weight and grandeur of German Panthers or Tigers, but in the Pacific they were untouchable enough. Against American weapons they were juggernauts, and every appearance drove home the same cold reality: the U.S. Army and Marine Corps lacked the firepower to meet them head-on. So the soldiers fought as best they could. They mined roads, set ambushes, begged for naval guns to rain fire on armored columns. Some battles were won that way through sheer numbers, through relentless pressure, through sacrifices piled high enough to bury Japanese defenses under bodies and shells. But victory always felt temporary, fragile, snatched from the jaws of forces that could not be stopped. On Okinawa, the nightmare returned with full force. The Shihas rolled down from ridges where no American thought they could climb, their guns blasting apart machine gun nests. Infantry followed, screaming, charging, dying, and charging again. Kelso watched his men empty magazines into the advancing tide, only to see the tanks roll closer. Unstoppable, inevitable. He remembered Saipan. He remembered Peleliu. And he knew with a clarity that froze his heart that nothing had changed. That was the cruelest truth of all. After years of war, after thousands of deaths, the Americans still lacked a weapon to turn the tide. Their courage, their discipline, their sheer willpower were not enough. Steel crushed flesh every time, and every battle seemed destined to repeat the same tragic script. The soldiers were not blind to it. They felt the despair creeping in, a hopelessness that gnawed at their resolve. Some swore aloud that Washington had abandoned them, that the generals back home did not understand. Others kept their silence, pushing forward because there was no other choice. But in their eyes and the set of their shoulders, as they dug foxholes and braced for another assault, the weight of inevitability was clear. And yet, even in that darkness, something stirred behind the lines. Orders moved quietly through headquarters. Engineers labored in secrecy. A whisper spread that perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans were preparing an answer. No one on those beaches could know it for certain, but history would remember that moment as the breaking point. The time when desperation finally forced innovation. The men of Okinawa fought on with rifles, grenades, and underpowered tanks, waiting for a miracle they no longer truly believed would come. And then, just when the nightmare seemed permanent, that miracle began to take shape. The search for a weapon had begun. In the wake of Okinawa's blood-soaked ridges and Saipan's burning sands, reports piled high on the desks of generals in Washington. Commanders in the field no longer minced words. Their memos spoke with the bluntness of men who had watched too many friends die. Our weapons cannot kill their armor. Our tanks are coffins. Unless a new gun arrives, the slaughter will continue. These were not complaints, but warnings, grim forecasts of defeat if nothing changed. At the Ordnance Department, the message hit with the weight of inevitability. American firepower, once the pride of the arsenal of democracy, had fallen behind. Something drastic had to be done, and it had to be done now. The war in Europe had already forced innovation. German Tigers and Panthers had forced the Allies to rethink everything they knew about tank warfare. But in the Pacific, the problem carried its own nightmare twist. The Japanese did not field the same steel behemoths as the Wehrmacht, yet their tanks, bunkers, and cave networks were just as untouchable for the weapons at hand. The challenge wasn't simply designing a new machine. It was designing it fast enough to reach men dying on islands thousands of miles away. The answer lay hidden in plain sight. In American arsenals stood a weapon already feared by the enemy, the 90mm anti-aircraft gun. For years, its barrels had thundered against the sky, tearing Japanese bombers from the clouds with blistering velocity. Soldiers who served the gun knew its power, the way it hurled steel faster than the eye could follow, punching holes through wings and fuselages with merciless precision. What if engineers asked that same velocity could be turned against steel on the ground? What if the gun that guarded the skies could also kill the monsters crawling out of the jungle? The idea was daring, almost reckless, but desperation demanded boldness. Technical drawings spread across drafting tables smudged with ink and sweat. The 90mm gun was massive, its recoil ferocious, its weight far greater than anything fielded in a tank destroyer so far. Mounting it on a vehicle meant challenges no textbook had ever solved. Turrets cracked under stress, hulls buckled from the strain. But the men working those nights in Detroit and Philadelphia understood what was at stake. They weren't building for theory. They were building for men, like Sergeant Kelso, men holding the line, with weapons that no longer worked. The factories never slept. Sparks showered from welding torches as new turrets were cut and cast. Machinery thundered, hammers rang, and furnaces glowed red with molten steel poured into molds that might save a soldier's life. Engineers debated over blueprints at midnight, their voices rising in frustration, then falling again into grim determination. Each failure, a cracked mantlet, an unbalanced turret, a jammed traverse, was another reminder that American boys were dying while they argued. The decision was made. The proven chassis of the M10 tank destroyer would be adapted, stripped of its old 3-inch gun, and fitted with the monster. A new turret was designed open-topped to shed weight, its rear counterbalanced with a heavy bustle that doubled as ammunition storage. The breech of the 90mm slid into place like a fist into a glove. For the first time, the impossible seemed within reach. But nothing about the process was certain. Test ranges became battlefields of their own. The gun roared, shaking the earth, hurling projectiles through slabs of steel meant to mimic enemy armor. Sometimes the recoil tore through the mounting, sending crews scrambling for cover. Other times the shell struck with devastating perfection, blasting through 9 inches of hardened steel at 1,000 yards. Onlookers felt the shockwave in their chests, a reminder that they were staring at a weapon unlike anything America had fielded before. Word of the tests spread quietly among soldiers returning home on furlough. Whispers reached barracks and training camps, a new gun, one that could finally kill what had once been untouchable. They called it the Long 90, a promise spoken with both hope and disbelief. After years of seeing their shots bounce like pebbles, could they truly believe in a round that would bite deep and kill? For the men in charge, belief wasn't enough. Speed was everything. Factories pushed limits never imagined, running day and night, turning out hulls, turrets, and breaches at a pace that left workers exhausted but unrelenting. Women on assembly lines riveted steel with hands blistered from heat. Truck drivers carried parts across the country through snowstorms and rain, knowing every lost day meant more bodies on Pacific beaches. It was not just production. It was a gamble, a last desperate wager that a single weapon could alter the tide of a global war. The generals understood the stakes. They knew doctrine had to change. American tanks had been designed to support infantry, to move fast and exploit breakthroughs, not to fight duels with enemy armor. That role had always belonged to the tank destroyer force hunter units meant to ambush and strike. But the doctrine had failed against the reality of Japanese defenses. The time for theory was over. Now survival meant brute firepower, a weapon that could meet enemy steel head-on and win. And so, in late 1943, and through 1944, the project accelerated with feverish intensity. The 90mm gun was refined its mounts, reinforced its shells, perfected for penetration. The M2 became the M3 designed specifically for vehicles. Armor-piercing capped rounds, high-velocity ammunition, each tweak pushed the weapon closer to the battlefield. The new machine, still without a name, began to roll from test tracks into reality. To the engineers, it was a machine. To the soldiers waiting across the ocean, it was salvation. They imagined the day when, instead of bouncing uselessly off a Kaiha's armor, their shot would tear through and ignite the beast from within. They imagined the moment when a Banzai charge, backed by tanks, would falter under the crack of a gun so powerful it turned inevitability into doubt. Still, doubts remained. The turret was open-topped, exposing crews to shrapnel and rain. Its armor was no thicker than before, meaning survival would still depend on skill and luck. But none of that mattered compared to what the gun could do. For the first time, the United States possessed a weapon that could pierce the myth of invulnerability. By mid-1944, prototypes had been approved. Production orders followed. The first vehicles rolled from factories like shadows of hope made steel. They bore the designation 90mm gun motor carriage M36. The soldiers would give it another name in time, one whispered with respect, the Jackson. Back on the islands, men still fought, with what they had still bled under the weight of Japanese armor. But change was coming. Behind them, on ships crossing the Pacific, the first of the new tank destroyers moved steadily toward war. For the men who had lived with despair, the whispers would soon become reality. A new weapon was on its way. And with it came the promise that the nightmare might finally end. The gamble had been made. Now the question was simple. Would the M36 arrive in time to save them? From the roaring furnaces and crowded assembly lines emerged a machine unlike anything the United States had ever fielded. At first glance it looked familiar. Another tracked vehicle, built on the reliable frame of the M10 tank destroyer. Its angular hull, a cousin to the Sherman. But what crowned it was new. A turret, massive and menacing, carrying a barrel so long it seemed to stretch into tomorrow. This was the 90mm gun, the weapon that promised to end the nightmare of invulnerable Japanese armor. The turret itself was a compromise between desperation and possibility. It was cast with sloping armor to deflect fire, but open at the top, leaving the crew exposed to shrapnel, grenades, rain, and the merciless Pacific Sunday. Engineers had argued over it endlessly. Close it off, and the vehicle would be too heavy, too slow. Leave it open, and the crew was vulnerable. In the end, time and weight won. The men who would fight inside would live with the risks. The barrel dominated the design. Long, sleek, and deadly, it jutted far beyond the hull like a lance aimed at the heart of the enemy. Inside, the breech mechanism was built to handle the savage recoil of shells that weighed nearly 24 pounds each. When fired, the weapon did not simply bark like the old 75 seconds. It thundered, shaking the ground, rattling teeth, and leaving ears ringing long after the echo died away. Crews who tested it for the first time compared it to holding lightning, a raw elemental force harnessed in steel. The strengths were undeniable. At 1,000 yards, the 90mm could drive through 9 inches of armor plate. At 2,000, it could still tear open anything the Japanese fielded, even the thickest bunkers carved into volcanic rock. Compared to the old 3-inch guns of the M10, the difference was night and day. Where once shells sparked and bounced, now they bit deep and killed. The range alone transformed tactics. No longer did tank destroyer crews need to wait at suicide distances for a flank shot. They could strike first and strike from afar. Against Japanese Chaiha tanks, the results were devastating. On test ranges, the 90mm split them open like tin cans, rounds passing through one side and out the other in sprays of molten steel. Even heavier Chi-Nu prototypes fielded in late desperation stood no chance. And it wasn't only armor. Concrete bunkers that had resisted Shermans crumbled under the impact of high-explosive rounds. Cave mouths, once untouchable without suicidal infantry charges, could now be sealed from hundreds of yards away with shells that turned rock to rubble. Yet the design carried its flaws. The open turret, meant to save weight and give crews visibility, was a curse in battle. Shrapnel rained down through it in artillery barrages. Snipers waited for the brief moment when a head rose above the rim. Grenades tossed from ridges fell directly into the fighting compartment, forcing men to scramble and heave them out before detonation. Rain soaked everything: powder bags, radios, maps, turning the interior into a swamp. In Okinawa's endless mud, canvas covers offered little protection. Armor protection remained thin. A Jackson could kill at long range, but if caught in the open, it could be killed just as easily. Its hull was Sherman steel, vulnerable to the same weapons that had roasted crews before. The new gun gave it teeth, but not invulnerability. Every man assigned to its crew understood the truth. Survival still depended on cunning, on using terrain, on striking before being struck. The comparisons were inevitable. To the British, it echoed their Firefly Sherman armed with the 17-pounder gun. But crews who tested both noted the difference. The American 90mm was steadier, its rounds more accurate at long distances, its penetration consistent. The German 88, dreaded across both theaters, was its true rival. In trials, the 90mm matched it shot for shot and in some conditions even surpassed it. For the first time, American gunners looked across the battlefield without envy. They no longer had to whisper about German or Japanese superiority. They had their own answer. But questions remained. Could this machine truly change the battlefield? Or would it become another name on the long list of desperate experiments? Soldiers had heard promises before. They had seen new weapons fail under real fire. The Jackson looked powerful. It tested powerful. But war had a way of humbling every invention. In training camps, gunners climbed into the new vehicles with awe. The turret felt cavernous compared to the old M10, the breech, a monster waiting to be fed. The power traverse system, electric fast, precise, swung the massive gun across arcs of fire with a smoothness unheard of before. For the first time, a tank destroyer could react to sudden threats in seconds instead of the agonizing crank of hand wheels. Crews drilled in, loading and firing shells, clanging as they were rammed home loaders, shouting commanders, barking orders. When the gun roared, the entire vehicle bucked like a living thing. Men staggered, grinned, and whispered to one another. This might be the one. Still in the back of every mind was the same gnawing doubt. They had been promised victory before, and victory had not come. They had been told their Shermans were enough, their tactics sufficient, their courage invincible. Yet the graves stretched on rows upon rows of white markers in island soil. Now once more they were being asked to believe. And so the Jackson rolled off assembly lines into waiting convoys, its long barrel pointed eastward toward jungles and beaches where men were dying daily. Soldiers who glimpsed them on flat cars whispered, "That's the one that will kill them." The sight of the 90mm lifted spirits in a way no speech or metal ever could. For the first time, hope felt tangible hope, made of steel gears and fire. Yet the war cared little for hope. On the Pacific Islands, Japanese tanks still advanced. Banzai charges still shattered lines. Bunkers still spat fire. The Jackson had been born, but it had yet to be tested in the crucible, where promises either held or broke. And so, the stage was set. America had finally built its answer, a weapon designed to meet the enemy on equal terms. The question that haunted every man who looked upon it was simple and deadly when the first shot was fired in anger. Would this machine deliver salvation, or simply another bitter lesson in futility? War does not grant miracles easily. Weapons are born in factories, tested on ranges, polished in theory, but only in battle do they reveal their truth. For the M36 Jackson, that truth came in fire and blood on the beaches and jungles of the Pacific. The first test was Leyte. Rain hammered the island, turning roads to rivers of mud, washing blood and cordite into the earth. American infantry pressed inland, exhausted from weeks of fighting, their eyes haunted by the familiar silhouette of Japanese armor breaking through the mist. Shiha tanks rumbled forward, their turrets swinging, infantry trailing in waves behind them. Men who had seen it before braced for the usual nightmare, the clatter of useless 75mm shells bouncing, the smell of burning. Sherman cruised, the cries of tanks, tearing across the line. But this time a different sound split the air. From the cover of a half-shattered palm grove, the long barrel of a Jackson swung into place. The loader's hands blurred, ramming a 90mm shell into the breech. The commander's voice cut through the chaos. On target fire. The shot cracked like thunder. The ground shook. Across the field, the lead Chiha shuddered as if struck by the fist of God. Its turret blasted skyward, flames erupting from its hatches, black smoke billowing into the rain. The Japanese infantry froze. For the first time, their steel beasts had died in a single shot. Another round followed, and another. Each roar of the 90mm sent shockwaves of panic down enemy lines. What had once been invulnerable was now prey. The change was instant and visceral. American infantry who had crouched low, expecting slaughter, rose with new fury. Cheers cut through the gunfire. "Get 'em, Jackson, tear 'em apart." They surged forward behind the tank destroyers, rifles, cracking grenades, arcing their confidence reborn. Soldiers who had once stared at approaching armor with dread now grinned grimly as the 90mm spoke for them. Okinawa told the same story, but on a scale so vast it shook the Pacific. Japanese defenses there were unlike anything before. Caves honeycombed through ridges, concrete bunkers hidden behind camouflaged shutters, tanks waiting in ambush like wolves in tall grass. American units landed knowing it would be hell. For days they paid in blood to move inches. Then the Jacksons rolled ashore. Sergeant Kelso, who had cursed his useless Sherman back at Peleliu, now stood inside the open turret of a Jackson, his hands steady on the breech lever. The memory of his dead men weighed heavy, but so did the knowledge that he carried something different now. As his crew took position on a muddy ridge overlooking a valley, he spotted the flash of Japanese armor moving through bamboo thickets. His throat tightened. The old reflex whispered, "It won't matter. The shell won't bite." But then the order came, and the 90mm roared. The Shy-Hi erupted in fire before its own gun could even train upward. One moment it was advancing confidently, the next it was a furnace of twisted steel. Kelso felt the recoil slam into his chest, rattling his bones, but instead of despair, he felt something else, triumph bitter and long overdue. All across Okinawa, similar scenes unfolded. Jacksons targeted bunkers that had defied artillery for days. Their high-explosive shells struck with such ferocity that shutters ripped away concrete, fractured, and entire cave mouths collapsed in thunder. Infantry who once crawled forward under machine gun fire now watched in awe as fortifications that had demanded suicidal assaults vanished in seconds. The Japanese were stunned. Their doctrine, built on the belief that American firepower lacked the punch to break their fortifications, began to crumble. Tank crews who had once laughed at Sherman shells now found themselves dying in fireballs. Infantry who once followed Chiha, spearheads in fearless charges, hesitated when they saw a long barrel silhouetted on a ridge. The predator-prey relationship shifted. Where once Japanese steel had hunted American flesh, now American steel hunted them. But the battlefield was never without cost. The Jackson's open turret drew fire like a magnet. At Shuri Line, a mortar round burst above a battery of Jacksons, raining shrapnel into the fighting compartments. Crews screamed as fragments tore through flesh. One tank went silent, its gun slack, its crew cut down, without a chance to fight back. Others fought on loaders, bleeding commanders, ducking low as bullets snapped overhead. The gun was mighty, but survival remained fragile. Still, the impact could not be denied. In one clash near Yonabaru, Japanese armor tried to flank an American regiment pinned in the valley. 3 Chiha tanks advanced confidently, their crews certain they could scatter infantry again. But waiting above, hidden by camouflage nets, were 2 Jacksons. Their gunners held their breath, sights steady. The command came fire. 2 rounds struck almost simultaneously. The lead tank exploded. The second slewed sideways, crippled. The third turned to retreat, only to catch a 90mm round through its rear. In less than a minute, the entire assault collapsed. Infantrymen cheered from the valley floor, their survival owed to a gun that had finally leveled the field. The psychological shift mattered as much as the tactical one. American soldiers who had once fought with clenched jaws and fatalism now carried themselves with a different posture. They advanced, knowing that somewhere behind them, a Jackson's barrel could speak on their behalf. They no longer whispered about certain death. When tanks appeared, they shouted for their own steel hunters to unleash fire. Confidence returned, and with it, momentum. For the Japanese, the shock deepened into dread. Reports filtered through their ranks of a new American weapon, one that killed armor with impossible ease. Bunkers once believed invincible now fell in clouds of dust. Even fanaticism could not mask the truth: their steel was no longer safe. The thunder of the 90mm had become a sound to fear. And yet, as the Jackson carved its legend in fire, one question loomed like a shadow. Could this machine hold against the full fury of the war still to come? For every victory, another test waited. For every tank destroyed, another ambush threatened. The battlefield had shifted, but it had not ended. The hunter had become the hunted, but hunters too could bleed. The hunter had become the hunted, but hunters too could bleed. And yet, despite the open turrets, the thin armor, and the constant threat of ambush, the Jackson's presence on the battlefield could not be denied. Its thunder echoed across the Pacific, reshaping not just tactics, but the very psychology of war. For the first time in years, American soldiers believed they could look enemy steel in the eye and win. That belief alone was a weapon. On Leyte, Okinawa, and countless smaller islands, the 90mm gun proved more than a tool. It became a statement. Every time a Chiha erupted in fire or a bunker collapsed under its high explosive rounds, the myth of Japanese invulnerability cracked a little further. American commanders noticed the shift. Infantry units fought harder when Jacksons were near advancing, with a confidence that had been absent since the earliest, darkest days of the Pacific Campaign. What had once been desperation turned into calculated aggression, backed by the certainty that their steel hunters could answer Japan's strongest defenses. The effect rippled outward. Japanese tank crews, once bold in their assaults, began to hesitate. Reports spread quickly: American guns now pierced armor with terrifying ease. Infantry, who had charged behind the cover of tanks, now found themselves exposed when those tanks burst into flames in the first minutes of battle. The thunderclap of the 90mm became more than just sound. It was the sound of inevitability, a reminder that the tide of war had shifted. In strategic terms, the arrival of the Jackson closed a gap that had haunted the U.S. Army and Marine Corps since the first tank clashes. It was proof that American industry, though sometimes slow to adapt, could still deliver salvation when pushed to the edge. The 90mm gun had not been designed for tank duels. It had been an anti-aircraft weapon turned ground killer by necessity. That transformation itself became a symbol of what the war demanded: adaptation, creativity, and a refusal to surrender to despair. The Jackson was not flawless. Crews continued to die in their open turrets, and the vehicle's thin armor meant it could never be mistaken for a heavy tank. Yet those flaws only deepened its legend. The men who fought in them did so knowing they were not invincible. They survived through skill, teamwork, and sheer nerve, wielding a weapon that could change the outcome of a fight in a single shot. They remembered nights when rain poured through the open roof, when shrapnel hissed overhead, when sweat and blood mixed in the turret as they loaded one more round. They remembered the moment a tank that had terrified them suddenly burned under their fire, and for the first time they felt the balance shift in their favor. When the war ended, the M36 Jackson did not vanish into silence. It rolled on into new conflicts, carrying its reputation with it. In Korea, its 90mm once again tore into enemy armor, this time Soviet-built T-34 seconds. Decades later, long after jets ruled the skies and missiles defined battle, Jacksons still fought in the Balkans, their long barrels roaring across ruined towns. Few machines of World War II survived into such an era, but the Jackson did, a stubborn relic that still carried the power to kill. Other nations adopted it: France, Belgium, Italy, South Korea, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan. To each it was more than surplus steel. It was a weapon with a story, a reminder of how desperation forged invention. Soldiers nicknamed it in their own languages, but the meaning remained the same. This was the gun that had once turned despair into hope, that had struck like a lightning bolt across the Pacific battlefield. The Thunderbolt of the Pacific, some called it a title earned, not in factories, but in fire and sacrifice. In museums today, preserved Jacksons stand silent. Their long barrels stretch outward as if still hunting, their open turrets bare to the sky. Veterans who served in them walked slowly around the hulks, their hands brushing cold steel, their eyes remembering the heat, the smoke, the smell of cordite. For them, the Jackson was never just a machine. It was salvation made tangible, proof that even in the darkest winter of war, something could arrive that gave them a fighting chance. The legacy of the 90mm gun and of the M36 Jackson itself is not measured in production numbers or technical specifications. It is measured in lives saved in morale, restored in the way a single weapon shifted the mindset of entire divisions. It is measured in the fear it carved into enemy lines and the courage it restored in American hearts. In the story of the Pacific, the Jackson stands as the weapon that broke the pattern, the machine that shattered the cycle of futility. It was never perfect. It was never invulnerable. But it was enough, and sometimes, enough is everything. It proved one truth that soldiers carried home long after the war ended, even in the darkest hour, even when defeat feels inevitable. A single weapon born from desperation and wielded with courage can alter the course of history. It proves that even in the blackest night when all hope seems lost, the tide of war can change in an instant. It proves that even in the darkest moment, one weapon at the right time can change the fate of a war. The war in the Pacific was a crucible of extremes: heat, mud, fanatic charges, steel grinding against steel. For years, American soldiers fought against an enemy that seemed untouchable, their weapons bouncing uselessly off armor and fortifications. They endured with grit, but they endured at a terrible cost. And then almost too late came the Jackson. The M36 was never flawless. Its open turret left men exposed to shrapnel and rain. Its armor could not rival the thick hides of German behemoths, nor could it shield its crews from every Japanese ambush. But perfection was never the point. What mattered was that the 90mm gun gave soldiers a fighting chance. It pierced bunkers once thought indestructible. It shattered tanks that had marched through fire unscathed. It gave hope where only despair had lived before. That shift was more than technical. It was spiritual. The thunder of the 90mm became the heartbeat of confidence, the sound that told weary men they were not helpless. For the Japanese, that same thunder was dread, a reminder that the tide had turned, that the predators of yesterday were the prey of today. In every shell fired, in every Chiha left burning, the balance of war moved closer to Allied victory. The Jackson's legacy outlived the war itself. It fought in Korea, rumbled through the Cold War, and even saw combat decades later in the Balkans. Few machines have carried such longevity, fewer still such symbolism. Preserved today in museums, it stands silent, but not forgotten. Its long barrel, a reminder of a time when history pivoted on the weight of a single round. In the end, the M36 Jackson was more than steel and firepower. It was proof of resilience, of adaptation, of human determination under the shadow of despair. It stands as a lasting testament to one truth: even in the darkest hours of war, a single weapon born from desperation and wielded with courage can change the fate of nations.